But I think that's it. Yeah. All right. Okay. So today we are going to go into chapter 14, which is the brain and the cranial nerves. So if you look at the brain has got three major regions, which is the cerebrum. Cerebrum is what, when you think about the brain, that's what you really think. What you normally imagine is this part here, this big part here. That is the cerebrum. Then there is a small part at the back below the cerebrum. That's the cerebellum. And the third part is this little stalk here, and that's called the brainstem. So it's like a stem, okay? Now, 83% is going to be the cerebrum. But this cerebellum, which is only 10%, is packed with nerves. So if you look at the number of neurons, it contains about 50% of the neurons. So even though small, it is mighty. Then you have the brainstem. Brainstem is very, very important. Why? Because that's where all the vital centers of the body. So when you say vital centers, what do you mean by vital centers? We have centers for respiration, heartbeat. All these are centers in the brain which control vital functions. So the brainstem is very, very important. And brainstem has got three regions. We'll come to that in a second. But basically, the brainstem is like a highway. It's connecting the brain, the cerebrum, cerebellum to the spinal cord. Okay, so the brain is continuing here as a spinal cord. All right, so let's move. Now, if you look at the cerebrum, let me see whether I can get this laser. Yeah. So if you look at the cerebrum, you can see there are two hemispheres, one on the left and one on the right. And there's a division in the middle. This is called a longitudinal fissure. Okay. And the two hemispheres are connected by what is known as the corpus callosum. So there is a horizontal band which is connecting the two together. That is the corpus callosum. And if you look on the surface, you can see there's a lot of folds and there's a lot of grooves. The folds are called sulci, which is a plural for sulcus, okay? And, sorry, the folds are called the gyri, okay? Or the singular is gyrus. So the fold is called the gyrus and the groove is called the sulcus. Plural is sulci. So if you look at the brain, you have this mountains and valleys. The mountains are the gyrus and the valleys are the sulcus. Why do you need these mountains and valleys? Simply to increase the surface area. That means you want to pack more brain power, which means you want to have more processing. Information processing has to happen. So the brain has got a few lobes, and there is a frontal, temporal, occipital, parietal. Mostly it is based on the overlying bones. We'll come to that soon. Let's look at the surface. So the brain has got an outer gray area, and when you cut it, you can see the inside is white in color. So you have an outer gray area, which is called the gray matter, simply because it's gray. And the inside is white, so we call it the white matter. Simple. What is a gray matter? Gray matter is a collection of the cell bodies of the neuron. You know, a neuron, the parts of a neuron. Yeah? There's a cell body and then axon, right? The cell bodies are all together packed, and that's the gray matter. And this little tail, which is the axon, they are all packed together, and that's the white matter. Okay, so now you know what is the gray matter and what's the white matter. What does the gray matter do? That's where the information is processed. What does the white matter do? Conducts the information, or the processed information is conducted through the white matter. Now, why is the gray matter gray and white matter white? Any ideas? Myelin. Exactly. Myelin, because it's axons, and axons are covered by myelin. So that's why it is white in color. So when you talk about the white matter, it's like tracks carrying the information from the gray matter to the other parts of the body or to the other parts of the brain. So it is full of tracks. So in a sense, gray matter is where the processing done, and white matter is the high-speed communication cables. Okay, does it make sense? Right. Now, the one difference is that in the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside, gray matter is on the inside. There's a reversal, okay? But in the brain, the gray matter is always on the outside. White matter is on the inside. So the brain has got 3 protective layers, and we call that the meninges. So the meninges has got 3 layers: dura mater, DAP, D-A-P, dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. Pia mater is the innermost, it's like a cling film. So if you, those who have done the brain dissection, when we removed the outer dura mater, you saw a shiny surface, right? That is the pia mater adherent to the brain. That's why it's shiny. It's because the pia mater is like a cling film attached to the brain. And there are 2 spaces which you need to know. One is below the dura mater, it's called the subdural space, and one is below the arachnoid mater, which is called the subarachnoid space. Now, meningitis. We talked about meningitis, right? I told you the symptoms. If you find somebody who has got severe headache, vomiting, high fever, then just go to the emergency room, because there's a possibility that it could be meningitis. Meningitis could be due to a bacterial infection, viral infection, could be due to many causes. So meningitis is, but we have this blood-brain barrier, which is very good. It's a good protection. We talked about that, and we'll be talking about that once again. And meningitis is a very serious disease. And when you go to the emergency room, they may want to take a sample of your cerebrospinal fluid. And what do you call that? Spinal tap. Yeah, it's called a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. So they will pass. So where does the spinal cord end? At the level of L1. So if you can pass a needle below L1, let's go one more level, L2. If you can pass a needle below L2 and draw some fluid, you won't damage the spinal cord. At the same time, you can get some fluid. So this is where we do a spinal tap. So it'll be the intervertebral space below. You can go below L1, but to be safe, go below L2. In case spinal cord is extending up to L2. And what do you get? You get the cerebrospinal fluid. And what do you do with that? You send it for examination, okay? And they will look at it first. So what is the normal color of it? It's colorless. CSF is colorless. And in the brain, it is seen in the subarachnoid space. It's seen in spaces inside the brain. It's called the ventricles. So it is seen surrounding the brain, and that is this here. You can see the arrows showing the flow. And how is CSF produced? It's produced from blood. And where is it produced? It's produced in these areas here. These little red areas here. You can see one area here, another area here. They are called the it's produced by a type of cell called ependymal cell. We learned about ependymal cell. We said that there are two types of cells in the nervous system. One is the neuron, and the other one is the glial cells. So ependymal cell is a glial cell, and that produces CSF. And you can see all the ependymal cells are here, and this little area is called the choroid plexus. So that's where the CSF is produced. Why do you need CSF? Because it's a protection. Number one, it's like a physical protection, like a water pillow. Okay, so if you move forward or back, your brain is not going to go and hit the bone because you have that watery pillow. Number two, it provides buoyancy. What do you mean by buoyancy? Floating. Like, say you're in water. Say before that, you're on land and you want to lift somebody, and that person is quite heavy, you can't lift him probably, or her. But if you go into water, what happens? You can lift that person. That is called buoyancy, okay? So CSF provides that buoyancy. So otherwise the brain will be crushed by itself. And CSF provides that buoyancy. It makes the brain lighter. Another thing is that CSF is what removes all the waste products. The brain is a very active tissue. I'm going to talk about that a little later. Very active tissue. It's a high metabolic tissue. Lots of waste is produced. So the CSF will flush away all the waste, and it regulates the chemical environment. Body is all about homeostasis. The body wants a constant internal environment, and CSF has to be within that tight range. It cannot be more acidic. It cannot be more alkaline. It has to stay within that range. That is what the general body wants, and that's exactly what the CSF wants. So that chemical stability is provided by the CSF. Flow of the CSF, which you need to know. And in the lab, there was a little model there, like a little alien spaceship. Did you see that? The one with a metallic model in the lab? Yeah. If you haven't, you can actually look. I've posted it online. I posted a video online on it, so you can have a look at it. I'll send you the link. I'll send it to the whole class. So if anybody hasn't seen it, I mean that's quite an important one because that'll be in the exam. So make sure you see it and you know it. And you can go to you can go to the ASC, and you can see all these models. Okay, make sure, and they also have a mock exam also. So make use of all these facilities. It's free. You don't have to pay anything. So the CSF flows into the flows through the lateral ventricle. You can see this is a lateral ventricle. And from there, it goes to the third ventricle. So this is where the third ventricle is. And I'll be talking about what structure. This is actually the thalamus, but we'll talk about that later. And from there, it passes through a little tunnel here. This is called the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct. And from third ventricle, it enters into the fourth ventricle. So this is the fourth ventricle. And from the fourth ventricle, it goes into the subarachnoid space. And it will be reabsorbed back into the blood. So actually it goes like this. It goes through here, and there's something called the arachnoid granulations, which absorb it and push us into the veins. This is a great vein which is surrounding the brain. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. So it absorbs the CSF and it is transferred into the venous flow. Okay, so the CSF is produced, but it is reabsorbed. That's why the CSF quantity, which is it's approximately 500 ml, is produced every day, and that same amount is removed, so it keeps it constant. What happens if there's a block and if it's not reabsorbed? You can get a hydrocephalus. Have you seen a picture of children with huge heads? Yeah, that's called hydrocephalus. And that's when the CSF is blocked for some reason. There's a blockage. So it's not reabsorbed. It's produced, it's not reabsorbed. So that'll increase the size of the head. And the treatment for that is a shunt. So what you do is that you put a little tube into it and you drain it. So that'll take off the pressure and the head will come back to the normal size. And I told you, where is the CSF produced? In the choroid plexus. Okay, remember, choroid plexus. But what are the cells that produces it? Ependymal cells. Okay, so blood supply. Does the brain have a good blood supply? You better have, because I told you that it is a high metabolic tissue. And the brain needs a lot of oxygen. Brain needs a lot of glucose. Brain can only take glucose. It cannot take fat, it cannot take anything else, only glucose. So these are the two things you have to give the brain, oxygen and glucose. Now let me give you a statistics which proves that the blood supply to the brain is critical. If the blood supply to the brain is interrupted for 10 seconds, you lose consciousness. If you have an interruption for 1 to 2 minutes, there is going to be significant impairment, which means significant damage. Just 2 minutes. And 4 minutes will cause irreversible damage. So that's the seriousness. That's why if a person is going into a cardiac arrest, what do you do first? Chest compression, CPR. Why do you do chest compression? You're pumping the heart. Why are you pumping the heart? To protect the brain. Because the brain is the vital organ which needs oxygen. And to provide that oxygen, if you're going to wait for 5 minutes, it's already gone. That's why every single person in this room should be knowing CPR. That's what saves lives. A person falls down, you don't have to worry whether you're a doctor or you're a nurse or a layman. Just See whether the person is breathing. There's a course for that you have to do. Of course, you have to do the course. It's for laymen. Okay. And every single person gets a chance to save a life. Okay. So this is a course which I always recommend that you should take. And you never know it. Maybe some of your, maybe at home, maybe it's a dear person. So try to make it a point to do this CPR course. Okay. So the reason for that is because brain has a high metabolic demand and there's no reserves there. If there's some reserves there, that's fine, can sustain for a little while. No reserves. All right. So we talked about meningitis, and I told you that there's something called a blood-brain barrier, and that's a barrier which prevents or it selects what gets into the brain. And that's a very, very strong barrier. It's got some advantages and it's got disadvantages. Oxygen and glucose can freely pass, no restriction. And, you know, the substance which pass will actually pass from the capillaries. Capillary is the smallest. So you have the arteries branch, they become capillaries. Capillaries again reform and forms the wing. So artery, capillaries, wing. From the capillaries that the tissues get the oxygen and get the glucose. How does it go out of the capillaries? Because there are gaps. In the capillaries, there are cells called endothelial cells. So there's an endothelial cell, another endothelial cell all around the capillaries. And there are gaps in between. And the oxygen will diffuse through the gaps. The glucose will diffuse, go into the tissue. The same thing, carbon dioxide will accumulate in the tissue, and that will go back into the capillaries, and that will go back to the into the blood supply, go to the lungs, and then the lungs will remove all the carbon dioxide and put oxygen in its place. So when the blood comes back through the arteries, you are having oxygenated blood. So that's what happens. So these little gaps in the endothelial cell is what allows the oxygen and the glucose to diffuse. But the blood-brain barrier actually makes these junctions very tight. It's called a tight junction. That is a junction between the endothelial cells, right? And what makes it tight is the astrocytes. You remember the astrocytes? It's one of the glial cells. In the nervous system, you have neurons and you have glial cells. And the glial cells, one is the ependymal cell, which we just discussed. Another one is the astrocytes. And you saw a slide of the astrocyte, right? It looks like a spider. Yeah. You see it once, you won't forget it. So that's the astrocyte. But what does the astrocyte do? See, this is an astrocyte here. It extends its legs and it attaches to an endothelial cell and it brings it closer so that gap is reduced. And this is called the blood-brain barrier, which is a function of the astrocyte. Good, because bacteria will not enter. Bad, because if you have a cancer of the brain, no drug will enter. No drug will reach there. What's the drug you give for cancer? Chemicals, yeah, chemotherapy. Yeah, chemotherapy. So chemotherapy doesn't work for brain cancer. There are other modalities of treatment. You can give radiation, you can have surgery, but chemotherapy is very, very difficult. All right, moving down, let's go to the third part, which is the brainstem. And the brainstem has got 3 regions. So this little part here is the brainstem, 3 regions. You have a midbrain, you have a pons, and you have a medulla oblongata. And I told you what's the importance of the brainstem? It contains vital centers. Okay, so it contains a cardiac center, which controls the heart rate, controls the respiratory center, which controls the respiratory rate. Vasomotor center controls the blood pressure. So all these vital centers, that's why if the brainstem is damaged, forget it, you're not going to survive because the vital centers will be knocked out. And also, coming to the medulla, medulla is this is the medulla, which is the bottom part of the brainstem, and it contains major motor tracts. And one of the major motor tract is the corticospinal tract. So we studied about the corticospinal tract in the last class. We said that is one of the descending tracts. And another thing, in the brainstem, there's something called the reticular formation, and I'll talk about that. That's something which is of great interest. Now, it's becoming very, very, very important. So the reticular formation is seen in the brainstem, and it is a mass of gray matter. So I told you that the gray matter is on the outside, right? And the white matter is on the inside. But there are other areas where there is gray matter, and the reticular formation is one of them. There's another area called the basal nuclei. We'll talk about all those things. So what I want you to know is that even though I told you that the gray matter is on the outside, there are small patches of gray matter distributed in the white matter. Okay. Second region is the pons. Pons is what looks like a beer belly. This is the pons. So if you look at the brainstem, we did a dissection of was it a sheep or a cow? Sheep, yeah, yeah. So the sheep, you can see there's a bulge here. This beer belly like structure, that is the pons. It lies between the midbrain and the medulla. And from here, there's a lot of cranial nerves coming out. So now I've introduced another word called cranial nerves. Why can't I just call it nerves? Because there are spinal nerves. We talked about spinal nerves, right? We said there are nerves coming from the cervical region, from the thoracic region, from the lumbar region, from the sacral region. They are all spinal nerves. And those nerves which are coming from the brain are called the cranial nerves. Okay, so here we have a few nerves coming out. How many cranial nerves are there? 12. There are 12 cranial nerves, and we'll be touching those cranial nerves briefly today. So from here, you have cranial nerve 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So these are the nerves which control eye movement. It controls facial sensation, hearing, taste, chewing, swallowing. All these things happen because these cranial nerves are coming out of the pons. Another thing is that the pons, what's behind the brainstem? What is this structure here, which cerebellum. The brainstem is actually connected to the cerebellum by bundles of tracts, and it's called the cerebral peduncles. Okay, so the cerebral peduncles connect the pons to the cerebellum, and what it does is that it will relay motor information to the cerebellum. What is the main function of the cerebellum? Balance. And I'll talk a little more about the cerebellum, about the functions, because it's got a little more than just balance. We'll come to that soon. So cerebellum, let's, for the time being, just remember that cerebellum is associated with your balance. Let's go to the midbrain, which is the topmost part of the brainstem. And here, so this is the midbrain here, okay? This is the midbrain. And if you look at the midbrain, you can see through the midbrain, there's a tunnel, and that's the cerebral aqueduct, okay? And this is a tunnel that connects the third ventricle, which is here, to the fourth ventricle, which is here. And on the back, you have these projections called colliculi. Do you remember we talked about colliculi? Can anybody remember what the colliculi is? I said there's a superior colliculi, inferior colliculi. So if you see a flash of light, what happens? There's a flash of light there. What do you do immediately? You turn your head. Or you hear a sound, a gunshot, without even anybody telling you. You'll turn and look, right? That is a reflex. And that reflex is managed by the light is managed by the superior colliculus, and the sound reflexes or auditory reflexes mediated by the inferior colliculus. Okay, and in the cow, in the sheep brain dissection, you have seen the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. And if you don't remember it, I am not sure whether ASC will have a sheep brain available. I doubt it. I don't think so. They have a lot of models, but I don't think. But you can. I'll send you a link for a video which you can check out, and you can see the cross the section of a brain and explaining all the parts. So the midbrain is the part which has the colliculi. It contains the cerebral aqueduct, and it contains it conveys the sensory signals between the spinal cord and this part here is called the thalamus. And again, you saw the thalamus, and that's one of the favorite. So normally in the exam, that they'll put a flag on a part of the brain and ask you to identify it. And thalamus is one of the favorite questions. So you need to know. You need to know all of it, but thalamus, pons, the midbrain, and medulla oblongata. Fourth ventricle, third ventricle. Lateral ventricle will be here under over here. This little membrane here is called the septum pellucidum. We talked about all these things in the lab. Again, I told you the brainstem has got the cerebral peduncles, which passes the information to the cerebellum. Now, there is another web, or there's some scattered gray matter which is in the brainstem, and that's called the reticular formation. So what is this reticular formation? Reticular formation is responsible for your alertness. So we all have a sleep-wake cycle, right? What do you call that? Circadian rhythm, right? So at night, everybody falls asleep. You wake up in the morning, right? So you have the sleep-wake cycle. So how do you go to sleep? It's because something is turned off in your brain. If your brain is constantly stimulated, you won't go to sleep. So in the brain, there is a switch. And that switch is the reticular formation. So you can off the reticular formation can off the brain, prevents any signals going to the brain, so your brain can go to rest. You need it, right? So this main switch is the reticular formation. So when the main switch is off, the cortex, cerebral cortex, or this cerebrum is not stimulated and the person can sleep. When the switch is switched on, the cortex suddenly becomes active. And that's when you wake up. So that's a main function of the reticular formation. Also, the reticular formation is involved in a lot of things like balance, posture, breathing, cardiovascular control, pain modulation. That's another thing. So different people have got different threshold for pain. Some people can tolerate a high amount of pain. Some people can't. Why? Because there's a modulation happening by the reticular formation. It can modulate the intensity of pain. And also, it's involved in habituation. Say, for example, if you are going to sleep and if there's a fan which is working and it's creating a sound, a humming sound, probably you won't be able to go to sleep initially, but after a while, what happens? You get used to it. What do you call that? Habituation. It's because you get used to the sound. And maybe after a while, you won't be able to sleep without that sound. That may or may not happen. But important thing is that there's this process called habituation. Otherwise, people in New York cannot sleep because most of the people live where the subways are going, right? And there's always a train going. So they sleep comfortably because it's this process called habituation. Again, that is a function of the reticular formation. So what it does is that it filters out some stimulus, and that's why you can sleep. But if you have injury of the reticular formation, you can end up in irreversible coma. So that's a very, very important thing. That's why the brainstem is very, very important. Damage to the brainstem is devastating. Now, I promised that I will talk about the cerebellum. Now we are in the cerebellum. We said, what is the main function of the cerebellum? Balance, yes. So cerebellum is located below and behind the cerebrum. So this is a cerebrum here. This is a cerebellum. And there's a fissure which separates it from the cerebrum, and this is called the transverse fissure. Okay? Like the cerebrum, there's a left side and there's a right side. And it's connected by a middle portion called the vermis. Okay? And the white matter, you can see the white matter here. It's like a tree-like appearance. And that's why it's called arbor vitae. So this is, you can see like a tree. And that's why it's called arbor. Arbor vitae means tree-like. Okay? The role of cerebellum. Now, motor coordination is, I told you about equilibrium or balance, but I want to talk a little bit about motor coordination. Now, where does the impulse, say for example, I want to pick this phone, okay? When I decide to pick the phone, where does the impulse comes from? It comes from the cerebrum. Which part of the cerebrum? There is a cortex, motor cortex, okay? It's called the precentral cortex. That is where the impulses comes from, precentral central cortex. So from the precentral cortex, the impulses comes out and it tells me, go and take the phone. So my hand is going to go and take the phone. Okay, I got the phone, straightforward. But now another scenario. The brain is telling me to take the phone, but the phone has moved. Now, the original decision to take the phone will not work because it has moved. So now I have to, something has happened here. What has happened is that the visual impulses has reached the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum knows the original plan, but the visual impulses reached the cerebellum, and the cerebellum understood there's a discrepancy now. If he moves his hand in the original order, he won't get there. So now the cerebellum makes that adjustment. It modifies the signal and makes your hand move further to grab the phone. That is what the cerebellum do. Okay, so that is called motor coordination. So cerebellum receives the information one intends to make. It receives visual or any other impulse about the position of, here I'm saying the position of a cup, which is probably, I'm going to grab a cup. The cerebellum will compare the two. If there's a discrepancy, it makes the necessary correction. Okay? So if you have a lesion in the cerebellum, you have a condition called ataxia. Ataxia means you have you seen, probably you might have seen some people walking in a very clumsy, awkward gait. Look at this picture here. You might have seen in the streets, and you might be wondering why are they walking like that? It's probably some damage to the cerebellum. Okay, so be kind to them. Okay, don't think that they are being awkward or anything. It's some kind of a damage that happened. Okay, so be very kind to them. Okay, diencephalon. Now, diencephalon is a region above the brainstem. We talked about the brainstem. So this is the brainstem, right? Brainstem has got three parts, we said. Midbrain, pons, and medulla. So say it again. Oh, okay. Medulla oblongata. Is that what you said? Good. Above the brainstem, you have the diencephalon or diencephalon. So it has got three regions: thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Thalamus is the topmost part of it, and this blue area is the thalamus. Okay, and you can see that in the sheep brain also. And this is actually called the gateway to the cerebral cortex. All the sensory signals going to the cerebrum will have a synapse here in the thalamus. What's a synapse? A neuron communicating with another neuron, right? We talked about synapses. So a synapse happens in the thalamus. And what the thalamus does is that it sends the signals to the appropriate area of the brain. So if you have a signal which has to go, if you have a signal coming from a visual signal, do you know where it goes to? Occipital lobe, because the visual center is in the occipital lobe of the brain. We'll talk about that. I just asked that question. So it's like a control center. It sends signal to the appropriate area. Likewise, the auditory signal, hearing, goes into another area of the brain. Smell goes to another area of the brain. So all the sensory signals are sent to the appropriate area by the thalamus. Hypothalamus, hypo means below. So it's below the thalamus, hypothalamus. And the main function of the hypothalamus is it controls the autonomic nervous system. I think that will be my next chapter. Chapter 15 is the autonomic nervous system. What do you mean by autonomic nervous system? It's a nervous system which is involved in the fight or flight. Okay? You have no control. You get frightened, your heart rate is going to go up, your breathing is going to get heavier. All these things are going to happen whether you like it or not. Autonomic. It's an autonomic. It happens without your control. Heart rate will go. Digestion is another function of the autonomic nervous system. And we'll be talking about that function. Endocrine system is also under the autonomic nervous system. It regulates body temperature, food and water intake. Again, it has got a role in the sleep-wake cycle, memory. We're going to talk a little bit about memory, emotional behavior, all these things. So the whole idea is that the body wants a constant environment. We call that homeostasis. Homeostasis is the basis of life. We want everything constant. When you move away from that constant environment, you become sick. Homeostasis is the basis of life. Now, the hypothalamus also controls the hormones. Like here, you can see this is the hypothalamus, and below the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary gland. Actually, it's connected to the pituitary gland by a stalk. And this stalk is called the infundibulum. And the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is like always think about the pituitary gland as a master endocrine gland. It's because it controls the other endocrine glands, right? But there is a master above it. And that is the hypothalamus. Epithalamus. This is the epithalamus. It's above the thalamus. Epi means above, right? So this is the epithalamus. And it has it's a very small area, but it has got a gland known as the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is also associated with production of melanin. I'm sorry, melatonin. Melatonin, okay? Why do you need melatonin? Yeah, so it makes you feel when melatonin is released. So when it's linked to light exposure. So when it is dark, melatonin is released and you go to sleep. Say you're traveling to, let's say you're traveling to Egypt, to the east. What happens to your sleep cycle? It all changes, right? You'll be waking at abnormal timings, right? Or you go to Russia. Times are changing. So you are not going to be sleeping at the right time till you get used to the melatonin has to start producing at the right time at night. So what do you do in case you go there, you have to attend a conference, you're feeling sleepy, you go to bed in the night, you cannot sleep because you're awake. So what do you do then? Take melatonin. That's why people carry melatonin tablets. So you pop a tablet and it'll make your brain go to sleep. So that is produced by so you can get it in a tablet form, but in the body, it's produced by the pineal gland. Lobes of the brain. How many lobes are there? 5. What's a lobe here in the front, under the frontal bone? Frontal lobe. Under the parietal bone? Parietal lobe. In the back, the occipital bone? Occipital lobe. On the side, we call this the temporal bone, temporal lobe. And there's one more lobe there, that's called the insula. So if you pull the temporal lobe down and you pull the frontal lobe up, underneath you can see a lobe, that's called the insula. Functions of each lobe. Frontal lobe is associated with higher functions. What are the higher functions? What are you doing now? Learning. It's a higher function. Motivation, judgment, planning. All these things are higher functions, which humans have. And so this is all in the frontal lobe. Also, there's a sulcus which divides behind the frontal lobe, which is the lobe here. This one here the parietal lobe. This is a parietal lobe. And separating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe is the central sulcus. Now, this is very important because there is a gyrus here right in front of the central sulcus. This is called a precentral gyrus, which is part of the frontal lobe. And this is the gyrus. This gyrus is called the motor command center of the brain. So when I want to take the phone, the command is coming from the precentral gyrus. Okay? And that's in the frontal lobe. Now, behind the central sulcus, you have the parietal lobe, but right here, you have what is known as the post-central gyrus. And this is the sensory command center, or that is a center. So if you get hurt, if you have pain, if you feel heat, cold, temperature, vibration, all that sensation, sensory sensation, okay, reaches the post-central gyrus. So 2 important areas you should know. Precentral gyrus, post-central gyrus. One is in the frontal lobe, one is in the parietal lobe. So that's a sensory processing center. The other one is the motor command center, okay? Occipital lobe is this green area here. This is the visual processing center, I told you. So anything which is visual will go here. Pain, temperature, and all will be going here. Motor command is coming from here. Okay, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe, this green color, deep green color. And the temporal lobe deals with hearing, smell, learning, and memory. It contains an area which is called the Wernicke's area. That is quite important. That is actually the site of language comprehension. So the reason why you can understand me is because your Wernicke's area is now active. That's why you can understand what I'm telling you. Okay? So Wernicke area is in the temporal lobe. And I told you, if you pull the temporal lobe down and the frontal lobe up, underneath you can see a lobe. That's called the insula. That is the lobe which is involved in taste. So you have a nice, you eat something, you feel it's tasty. that is appreciated by the insula. What are the special senses we have? 5 senses we have. Tell me, yeah, vision, hearing, then what? Taste, yeah, 3. Smell, 4. And I told you the visual is in the occipital lobe. Okay, remember that. Visual is in the occipital lobe. Hearing is in the temporal lobe. Olfaction is also in the temporal lobe. Gustation, which is taste, is in the insula. Okay, back to the gray matter, and because I told you initially gray matter is on the outside. Now I'm going to add something. We'll be talking about other areas where the gray matter, but before that, I want to talk a little bit about gray matter and white matter. So I said beneath the gray matter, you have the white matter, right? And what is a white matter composed of? Myelinated neurons. Yeah, correct. Now they are in tracks. Okay. So there are tracks, and we talked about the different tracks in the spinal cord. What are the different tracks? Tracks which go down, descending tracks, ascending tracks, ascending tracks, descending tracks. All these are tracks. The brain or the white matter is composed of tracks. Now, there are 3 types of tracks which I want you to know. One is called the commissural tract, which means they connect the left side to the right side. So you have a left hemisphere, right hemisphere, right? The brain is cerebrum has got left and right. They are connected by an important tract, which you know when you did the dissection. What is that tract called? Corpus callosum. Yeah. That's a main tract connecting the left and the right. You have to know that, okay? That's going to be in your exam. So such a tract is called a commissural tract, left to right. And then there are association tracts. So you have little tracts which connects the little areas here. So for example, this gyrus is connected to here. This one is connected to here. Within the lobe, you have connections. And these connections are called association tracts. And then there are projection tracts. Those are the vertical tracts we discussed earlier in the spinal cord. They extend vertically. They connect see over here, you can see this is a cerebrum. It's connected to the rest of the body through these vertical tracts, and they are called the projection tracts. So the projection tracts are really the big highways. They are the super highways. Coming back to the gray matter. What is a gray matter composed of? Cell bodies. Okay. Now we're getting the flow of it. It's not new information now. You know it. White matter is axons, myelinated axons, bundles of myelinated axons. Gray matter, white matter. Now, at this stage, you have to start understanding the composition quite well. Okay, so I told you the gray matter on the outside of the cerebrum, which is the part where thinking happens. So when you're thinking, that's the area which is used. That's the gray matter on the outer surface of the cerebrum. But there's gray matter underneath also. There's gray matter. It's not like a layer of gray matter like the surface layer. It's scattered here and there. And the important ones are the basal nuclei. So you can see this is a basal nuclei or basal ganglia. So they are like clusters of gray matter, which is seen. What is this structure here? Eh? Thalamus, correct. The thalamus. You have to know the thalamus, okay? If you don't know, just have a look at the video. I'll send it to you guys of the brain that we dissected. So the thalamus, near the thalamus, there is a lot of gray matter here. See this green area here? That is gray matter. And this is called the basal nucleus. And actually, there are three main nucleus. There's a caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus. Okay, so that's one set of gray matter. There's another mass of gray matter which is concerned with your emotions, and that's called the limbic system. So the limbic system is a mass of gray matter which is connecting your emotions. And over here, you have a few important areas, prominent areas. It's called the cingulate gyrus. You can see it here. This is the cingulate gyrus. Right above the corpus callosum, this is the cingulate gyrus. And there is another area called hippocampus. Again, part of the limbic system. And actually, the hippocampus is called the brain's library, because it kind of catalogs all the experiences you have. So if you have some memories, emotional memories are very powerful. So for example, you might get a smell of a particular flower, and if that's associated with an emotional experience, you always remember that quickly. Okay, so that's the area called hippocampus. And there's another area here, which is the amygdala. So this is the amygdala here. Over here, you can see this is the amygdala. Yeah, the bottom of this C-shaped structure, this is the amygdala. And that's the area or this is a center where emotions are processed. Now coming to sleep. What is sleep? Sleep is a temporary state of unconsciousness. It is not permanent because you can awaken from it. And you know there are several stages. You know about the REM sleep, right? What is REM? Rapid eye movement. So during REM sleep, your eyes will be moving rapidly. And there's non-REM sleep where there's no eye movement. And during REM sleep, your memories or your learning is strengthened. That is when what you learn is consolidated. So you need sleep if you want to remember. Part of memory is to reinforce the connections. So now you are understanding something. You're not really learning now. You're listening to me. And you're trying to process, but I'm moving forward, so you don't have enough time to process. So you're kind of assimilation. You're assimilating information now, but you haven't processed it. Now you go home, you'll be taking your notes or you'll be watching the video, whatever, and then you start learning. Okay? And then if you have books, you have different helpers. You'll be reading your readings. You will be doing those questions, thinking. That's when the thinking happens. That's when your neural connections get strengthened. But in order to put that into your hard drive, into your memory, you need to sleep. That's when memories are strengthened. And also sleep is important because that's the time when your ATP, you get some rest, your reserves are replenished. Glycogen, ATP, all those things. And during REM sleep, there's an increased brain activity. And that's when you dream a lot. So sleep is crucial for mental, physical, and also for consolidation of your memory. What is EEG, electroencephalogram? Electroencephalogram is a tool for monitoring brain activity. So this is a EEG, and you have different waves, alpha wave, beta wave. Alpha is you're awake but resting. This is what it looks like. Beta means you're engaged in a concentrated mental activity. Theta means you're drowsy, and delta means you're in deep sleep. Cognition. What is cognition? It's the process of acquiring and using knowledge. So now you're in the process of acquiring knowledge. Then your brain starts thinking, how can I use this information? What are the things I can do with this information? And this is done by different parts of the brain. How do you know which part is doing what? It's not very easy. For that, we have to depend on certain areas which are damaged. For example, if the frontal lobe is damaged and the person exhibits a particular behavior or does not exhibit a behavior, we know that behavior is connected to that area of the brain. So I want to show you an example. This was a guy called Phineas Gage. He's a British guy. He was a railway worker. So he got an injury. This big pole went straight through his face, came out through his brain. And actually, he walked to the hospital. He was actually conscious. He walked to the hospital. They took it out. And they understood that the frontal lobe, because it's coming through here and coming out here, so the frontal lobe was damaged. He recovered, but then they understood that he had some behavioral changes. His behavior totally changed. He was a very responsible guy, careful. Then he became very responsible. He could not plan. That's how they understood that the frontal lobe is connected with these functions: behavior, planning, all those things. If you have a damage of the temporal lobe, which is on the side here, then you will have difficulty recognizing objects, and that's called agnosia. And we talked about memory. Memory involves learning, storage, retrieval, and part of memory is forgetting also. Because the brain cannot keep all the information that you get. Some information, if you don't process it, that information will be discarded. Brain is very quick to erase information also. It likes information, but it's very quick to erase the information if you don't process it. That's what learning is. You're processing that information, making it useful so that the brain can use it. Then the brain will say, this is good information, I'll keep it. So you have to convert your information into something useful. Amnesia means loss of memory. Anterograde amnesia means you cannot store any new information, you forget very quickly. And retrograde amnesia means you have difficulty recalling previous events that happened in your life. Primary sensory cortex and association areas. Okay. So we said the primary sensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus. Remember that, okay? Primary sensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus, and primary motor cortex is the precentral gyrus. And adjacent to the primary areas, there are association areas also. The association areas actually take the information and give it more meaning. Okay. So the primary sensory cortex is where all your pain, touch, pressure, temperature goes. And this is the primary sensory cortex. And in the primary sensory cortex, there's a map. You can't see a map or anything, but there is a map. We call that the little man map. So what is this little man map? So I told you it's the sensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus. This is the primary sensory cortex. And this is the map I'm talking about, the little man map. And this is called the sensory homunculus. So if you look at this map here, you can see it's like a little man, right? And you can see it's not proportional to the size of the organs. For example, here, the face is very big. The hand is very big. The body is small. This is a tongue. Tongue is very big. So why is this like that? It is because the representation of these areas are very high. The face is a very sensitive area. So size is proportional to sensitivity. Face, lips, fingers, very sensitive. Similar to that, in the precentral gyrus, there is a motor homunculus, another little man. Okay, and the little man map also has similar features. The face is very big, hand is very big, and all this represents the areas which has a high, which needs a high representation because they are associated with fine movements. So the face is associated with talking, chewing, a lot of things happening there, taste. So it needs a big representation. Hands, similarly, also very important because if you want to do something fine, you use your hands. Your legs you don't use your legs to work, right? You just use it for walking. So legs have a small representation. It's not used for delicate movements. Language, yeah. Sorry? Say that again. For going upstairs. I didn't get the question.
Saying like when you're walking upstairs, think about it.
Yeah, okay. So when you're walking upstairs or you're simply walking, it's actually signals are coming from the brain, from the which area? Precentral gyrus. That's where that's motor command center. It tells you to walk. But the spinal cord takes over repetitive movements. So the brain doesn't have to burn itself to tell you, okay, move your left leg forward. Now the right leg has to relax. Now next you have that repetitive process is taken over by the spinal cord. So but it starts from the brain, the precentral. But repetitive movements, the spinal cord will take over and will continue. So you can keep walking until you reach an obstruction. So then your cerebellum comes into play, your cerebral cortex comes into play, these modifications happen, and then everything, the plan changes. So it's a very, very complicated thing, but it's smoothly coordinated. So you can understand the complexity of how these things happen. So it's not like a one sentence answer because many things are involved. And we are trying to get a overview of the whole thing now. Okay, did I answer your question? Yeah. So if you think about language, what time is it? Okay, we have another 3 minutes. There are two main areas, Wernicke's area and Broca's area. The difference is that Wernicke's area is for understanding and Broca's area is for production of speech. So when I'm speaking, my facial muscles are moving, my tongue is moving, all these things happen because the Broca's area is controlling it. And now when I speak, you're understanding because you have the Wernicke's area, which is hyperactive now. You're listening to what I'm saying, and this area is located in the temporal lobe. Now, I told you that we have a left and right. Left is associated with analytical thinking. Right is associated with imagination, insights, like for musical skills, artistic skills, that's all right side brain. Left side brain is more like math and science and all. What connects the two together? Corpus callosum. Okay. I'm trying to get that out of you so that you can remember it. But that doesn't mean that each side is doing work on its own. Both are doing it together, but the contribution will be more from one side. And then finally, this is the area which gives off the nerves. So I told you, we learned about the spinal nerves. We're going to talk quickly about the cranial nerves. Just, I will overshoot 1 minute, but please bear with me. Okay? So there are 12 cranial nerves, cranial nerve 1 to cranial nerve 12, okay? Cranial nerve 1 is called olfactory nerve. Olfaction means taste. So if you damage that, you won't be able to taste. Optic nerve is associated with vision, right? You damage that, you'll become blind. Optic nerve, the cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6, they are associated with eye movement. So to control the movements of your eyes, you have to have these 3 nerves working together. Cranial nerve number 5 is called trigeminal nerve. This is a nerve that supplies the face, and also, so when you're in the face, you have the chewing movement, so all that is controlled by the trigeminal nerve. Then you have a nerve called facial nerve. Facial nerve supplies the muscles of the face, and if you have damage to the facial nerve, you have a condition called Bell's palsy. Remember that, Bell's, B-E-L-L-S, Bell's palsy. So that means the face will become, one side of the face will become paralyzed, so they will have a very peculiar look if it's damaged. Vestibulocochlear nerve is the nerve which is associated with hearing, but it's got one more function. It's called vestibulocochlear. Vestibulo means it is a part which controls balance. Your inner ear is concerned with balance also. So if you have an inner ear problem, you can lose your balance. Also, it is concerned with hearing. So vestibulocochlear. Cochlear is a part which is associated with hearing. Vestibular part is the part which is associated with balance. Okay, so that's why it's called vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 8. And finally, the last nerve which I want to talk about is vagus. Vagus is one important nerve because it has got extensive distribution. It goes all over the body. It controls the heart rate, respiration, digestion, urinary functions, a lot of things. So even though it's starting from the, the head and neck area, it covers a majority of the body. So it is extensively, it's got an extensive distribution. That ends the brain, and there's no time for questions. But if you want to ask me any questions, feel free.